The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they always did, that constant electrical drone that had become background noise 3 years ago. Brooke Sullivan pushed through the double doors of Sacred Heart's third-floor cardiac unit at 6:27 a.m., her scrub still damp at the collar from the San Diego heat outside, the fabric clinging to skin that remembered different climates, dust storms in Kandahar, salt spray in Coronado, the metallic taste of desert air at 2,000 feet. She moved past the nurse's station without making eye contact, a practiced invisibility she'd perfected the way other people perfected handshakes. The overnight staff barely registered her arrival. Good. That was always good. The unit was just waking up. Machines beeped in their syncopated patterns, ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythms, and somewhere down the hallway a monitor alarm chirped once before someone silenced it. The smell hit her first, that particular combination of antiseptic and coffee and something underneath it all that smelled like fear, though nobody called it that. They called it the smell of a hospital. Brooke called it familiar because she'd learned long ago that fear had a consistent chemical signature, whether you were in a field hospital outside Helmand Province or on the third floor of a San Diego cardiac unit. The cold stainless steel of the medicine cart gleamed under the harsh white lights as she logged into the computer, pulling up her patient assignments for the day. Room for 12 was halfway down the east corridor, the third bed from the window. She knew the way without thinking about it. 6 years of shifts, 3 years at Sacred Heart, and her feet had already mapped every tile, every corner, every squeaking wheel on the crash cart. The morning light was just starting to filter through the windows, painting everything in that particular shade of grey gold that made the world look underwater. The mute veteran was already awake, which meant he'd probably been awake for hours. His eyes tracked her movement the moment she entered the room, and she watched something flicker across his face, not recognition exactly, but something closer to hunger. He was 52 years old according to his chart, though the scars around his left temple and the way his left shoulder sat maybe an inch lower than the right suggested he'd been through more in those 52 years than most people experienced in a century. His throat bore the horizontal scar of a tracheostomy that had been closed 3 years ago. He'd regained the ability to speak, technically. The chart noted he simply chose not to. Some traumas lived in the throat and never left. "Morning," Brooke said, keeping her voice level, keeping her movements economical. She moved to the 4-line first, checking the saline flow rate, the dressing around the catheter site. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, because she had. 10,000 times plus maybe another 1,000 before that, in contexts nobody here needed to know about. Her fingers bore scars that didn't match nursing. A crescent-shaped gouge on her left palm from a ricochet. 3 parallel lines on her right forearm from something she never talked about. Her knuckles had a thickness to them, a certain architecture that came from training rather than genetics. "How's the pain level today?" He didn't answer, but he pointed to the number 3 on the pain scale taped to the wall. His eyes didn't leave her face. She'd seen him stare like this before, like he was trying to solve an equation. Like something was almost coming back to him but not quite. The veteran shifted slightly in the bed, and that's when she saw it. His left forearm, right there along the inside of the bicep, where men sometimes got tattoos when they wanted to keep them hidden under long sleeves. Block letters, expertly done, black ink on weathered skin. Her name. Brooke. She didn't pause. She didn't flinch. She ran her fingertip along the foot tubing the same way she always did, checking for kinks, making a mental note that the bag would need replacing in about 2 hours. The machine beeped. The ventilator wheezed. Outside the window, the traffic on Harbor Drive was starting to thicken as San Diego woke up. Everything was exactly as it should be. Nothing had changed. Except everything had, because she'd spent 3 years building a fortress of anonymity in this hospital, and somewhere in Kandahar, 6,000 miles away, his face had lived in her hands, in memory that stayed buried, that she'd learned to carry like stones at the bottom of a river, heavy enough to stay submerged. "Your labs look good," she said, her voice steady as a held rifle. "We'll get you breakfast in a few minutes. Soft diet still, okay." He made a sound in his throat, not quite words, but something that acknowledged her. His eyes stayed on her face, searching. She focused on the monitor, watching the cardiac rhythm trace its familiar pattern across the screen. The rhythm was textbook normal. His vital signs were stable. Everything was fine. Everything had been fine until it suddenly wasn't. She finished her assessment at exactly 7:13 a.m. and moved out into the hallway, her shoes clicking softly on the tile. The other nurses were clustered near the break room. Marcus from the overnight shift was updating them on the admissions, his voice dropping into that particular cadence that meant he was ready to hand off and disappear. Brooke bypassed them and headed toward the supply closet to restock her cart. Alone was better. Alone was always better. Alone meant nobody tried to make conversation. Alone meant nobody asked questions about her history or her references or where exactly she'd worked before she'd landed here in San Diego with a vague gap in her employment history that the hiring manager had decided not to scrutinize too closely. The supply closet smelled like plastic and cardboard and the faint chemical tang of adhesive. She reached for the dressing packs, her movements precise and practiced. Her left hand trembled for approximately 0.3 seconds, not from fear, but from what she'd been trained to call somatic stress response, the body's way of remembering things the mind insisted on forgetting. She made a fist, counted for heartbeats, and the tremor stopped. Pain was information. Trembling was just data. She'd learned to read her own body the way a pilot reads instruments, cold and clinical and without judgment. The morning rounds hadn't started yet, which meant Dr. Hargrove hadn't made an appearance. She could predict his movements now, the way he moved through the unit like a man accustomed to deference, the way people straightened their posture when they heard his voice. He was good at his job, that was the complicated part. Competent. Precise. The kind of cardiologist who actually read the overnight notes and caught things that other people missed. It was just that he'd also figured out, very quickly, that the quiet nurse with the careful hands and the careful eyes didn't respond to the usual hierarchies that kept him comfortable. But that wasn't the worst part. At exactly 8:22 a.m., during the morning cardiac rounds, the mute veteran began to seize. Not a big movement, something quieter, more sinister. His jaw clenched, his eyes rolled back just slightly, and the monitors started to sing their alarm song. Brooke was there before anyone else, her hands moving on their own, muscle memory taking over. She had his airway positioned correctly before the resident even processed what was happening. She was already reaching for the at even before the attending opened his mouth to order it. Dr. Hargrove stood at the doorway, his eyes narrowed, watching her work. Not helping. Just watching, the way a lion watches something interesting before deciding what to do about it. That's when things started to change. After the seizure stopped, after the patient had stabilized and the resident had ordered a neurology consult and Brooke had charted every second of the event with methodical precision, she waited until her shift ended at 3 p.m. The unit was quieting down. The day shift was passing off to evening staff. And instead of heading to her car, she took the elevator back up to the 3rd floor and walked to room for 12. The mute veteran was sleeping, but he woke the moment her shadow crossed his face. His eyes found her immediately, that same searching intensity, like he was looking for the answer to a question he couldn't ask out loud. Brooke pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down without speaking. She didn't have a good explanation for why she was doing this. The shift was over. She should be leaving. She should be driving back to the small studio apartment in Ocean Beach that she paid for in cash, where there were no photographs on the walls and no furniture that couldn't fit in a car. Anonymity required discipline. But his eyes kept searching her face, and her name was tattooed on his arm, and somewhere in the architecture of her memory lived a moment in Kandahar where she'd wrapped her jacket around a bleeding man and whispered coordinates into a radio while the world exploded around them. She'd called for the medevac. She'd held pressure on the wound. She'd memorized the exact shade of his blood on her hands because memory was the only thing she could hold on to and bring home. "It's okay," she said quietly. "You're safe now." He made that sound again, the one that wasn't quite words, wasn't quite language, but was absolutely intention. His hand moved across the bed. She let him find hers. His grip was surprisingly strong, the hand of a man who'd been trained for violence and had survived something worse. Outside the window, San Diego was turning golden as the afternoon light began its slow descent. The machines beeped. The ventilator wheezed. And Brooke Sullivan, who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of disappearing, sat in room for 12 and allowed herself to be found by someone who'd never know that the nurse holding his hand was the woman who'd carried him to safety while Kandahar burned around them. She had 3 bronze stars folded inside a shadow box in her garage, a Navy Cross in a locker she'd rented under a false name, and a service record that existed on classified servers that she'd learned to access from a civilian network, just to make sure the lie held. She was no one. She was invisible. She was just a nurse with steady hands and a careful way of moving through the world, and the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining pressed against her ribs like a secret she would carry to her grave. She stayed until 4:44 p.m., then slipped out of the room and back into the hallway, where the evening shift was already moving into position and Dr. Hargrove was still somewhere in the hospital, probably in his office, probably making calls. She could feel the weight of his attention on her now, the way a careful predator notices when something in the territory has shifted. She'd exposed something today during that seizure. Some reflex that went too deep, that came from somewhere too trained to be explained by regular nursing school. Dr. Hargrove had noticed. And men like him, men accustomed to control and hierarchy, did not take kindly to nurses who knew things they didn't, who moved with competencies that shouldn't exist in their domain. Everything was about to change. She could feel it the way soldiers feel where the pressure changes before a storm. Something was coming. The pressure came in waves, invisible as a change in barometric pressure, the kind that soldiers feel before a storm. By 6:08 a.m., Brooke could taste it, that sharp copper tang of institutional machinery shifting against her. Dr. Hargrove was waiting. It started in room for 12 during rounds. The patient's mother sat in the visitor's chair, her face tight with worry lines, and Hargrove swept in with his white coat trailing like a cape. Brooke was adjusting the fall-line, a routine check, when he appeared at the foot of the bed. "Miss Sullivan," Hargrove said, his voice pitched high enough for the family to hear, "might I have a word?" She straightened. Turned. Met his eyes with the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. "Of course, Doctor." He waited until the family was watching. Until the mother leaned forward. Until the air in the room went thin as altitude. "You are a nurse. Not a neurologist. Not a cardiologist. Not a diagnostician." Each word landed like a puncture. "When I observe you inserting yourself into clinical decisions, checking lab values without orders, speaking to specialists as though you have credentials you do not possess," he paused. Drew breath. "That is insubordination." The mother's eyes moved from Brooke to Hargrove. The patient's hand trembled. Brooke did not flinch. Did not redden. She simply stood there, her breathing unchanged, and said, "I was ensuring the 4 remained patent, Doctor. You were overstepping. Again." He turned to the mother. "You can see how easily boundaries become blurred in an understaffed unit." Back to Brooke. "It stops now. Do you understand?" "Yes, Doctor." "Do you?" His smile had teeth. "Because I'm beginning to think you don't know what you are." The silence lasted 3 seconds. Brooke's hand lowered. She wiped her palms on her scrubs and said nothing at all. That was her answer. That was her composure. One breath. Measured. Controlled. A held rifle at rest. When she turned to leave, she could feel the mother's confusion, the way people felt uncomfortable witnessing power used this way, not shouted, just precisely applied. Hargrove watched her go with the expression of a man who had not gotten the reaction he wanted. His jaw tightened. His fingers curled. The break room at 7:13 a.m. was where it happened differently. Brooke pushed through the door with her coffee thermos, and the room, which had been populated by 3 nurses sharing a chocolate donut and conversation, emptied as though she carried contagion. They didn't excuse themselves. They simply stood, gathered their cups, and filed past her with their eyes straight ahead. The donut remained on the table, 1 bite taken. She sat anyway. Poured her coffee. Watch the steam rise. Listen to the fluorescent light hum its mechanical song. The thermos was old, blue with a faded San Diego Fire Department logo, a gift from 3 years ago that she had never explained. She held it between her palms and thought about the sound of mortar fire, which was not so different from the sound of a doctor's scalpel cutting through institutional authority. She was alone for exactly 4 minutes when Miguel, a respiratory tech she had worked with for 2 years, appeared in the doorway. He saw her. His face shifted. He reached for his empty cup, fainted toward the sink, then changed course and left. Nobody sat with her. Nobody asked how she was. The room had learned to be an island when she was in it. The write-up appeared at 8:22 a.m. on the unit board, not printed on regular paper, but on cardstock in red ink. Perform duties outside scope of nursing practice. Insubordinate conduct during medical rounds. Failure to maintain professional boundaries. The signature was Hargrove's, formal and looping, and every staff member who walked past read it. Some lingered. Some whispered. Some glanced at her as she stood at the medication cart and pretended she had not seen it. But she had seen it. Everyone had. That was the point. Brooke moved through the rest of the shift like a woman walking underwater, present in the room but not quite there, her hands performing the small rituals of nursing while her mind tracked something else entirely. At 2:38 p.m., when no one was watching, she went to the board and read the write-up herself. The words did not cut. She had seen worse things in darker places. But she could feel the eyes on her, the way a hunted animal feels the predator's attention. The way she had felt it in Kandahar when the rooftop spotter's breath caught through the radio. At 3:51 p.m., the hallway cleared for 5 minutes. Brooke walked to room for 12, pulled the chair close to the bed, and looked at the patient's arm. There it was, her name in block letters, permanent and certain as a stone marker. Brooke. The letters had faded from blue to that peculiar grey-green of old tattoo ink, the kind that survived years of sun and salt water and violence. One tear escaped. Just one. She felt it drop onto her cheek and wiped it without breaking eye contact with the man whose name she could not speak and who could no longer speak hers. "I remember," she whispered. "Even if you don't. I remember." When she turned to leave the room, Hargrove was standing in the doorway. His expression shifted from surprise to something darker, the look of a man watching his carefully constructed narrative begin to crack. She had been grieving. That was not in his script. She was supposed to crumble. To cry in the supply closet. To become small and frightened. Instead, she stood. "You mistake care for insubordination, doctor," she said, her voice steady as a held rifle, "but I've served under worse than you." The room went so quiet you could hear the heart monitor's steady beep. Hargrove's face colored, not red, but a deeper shade of something colder. His hands curled into fists. "You have no idea what you've just said to me," he whispered. "Then we're even," Brooke replied. "Because you have no idea who you're standing next to." She moved toward the door. He did not step aside until the last possible moment, and even then it was grudging, a yielding of physical space that was not the same as backing down. She could feel his eyes tracking her down the hallway, and she knew with the certainty of a woman who had read survival signs for 2 decades that he was already making calls. Board members. References. Investigators. He would burn her down methodically, professionally, the way he had been trained to do. What happened next arrived like the sound of rotor blades cutting through a San Diego afternoon, sudden and violent and impossible to ignore. The alert came through the overhead speaker at 4:06 p.m., the kind of alert that made every trained ear in Sacred Heart go rigid. Code Blue, room for 12. Code Blue, room for 12. Brooke was halfway to the supply closet when she heard it. She turned. Her body moved before her mind caught up. Room for 12. The patient. The man with her name permanently written on his skin. She ran. The room was already full when she arrived. Hargrove was there, 2 residents were there, a crash cart had been wheeled in with its red frame and terrible promise. The patient's heart was failing. She could see it on the monitor, wild electrical activity that meant the heart was no longer pumping, just fluttering like a bird in a trap. "Epi going in," someone called. Still in V-fib, the resident shouted. Hargrove moved toward the patient with the confidence of a man who had saved lives before. He reached for the defibrillator paddles. His hands were steady. His voice was clear. But he was making the wrong call, and she knew it the way she knew the difference between incoming fire and outgoing, instinct that had been carved into her bones by 13 years of combat operations. She could see the tamponade blooming in the way the CVP line was reading, the pressure climbing, the heart trapped inside its own fluid, each beat pushing against an increasingly inelastic sac. A standard defibrillation would not work. It was like trying to restart an engine that was drowning. He had maybe 60 seconds before the situation became irreversible. Brooke stepped forward. "Pericardiocentesis," she said. "Now." Hargrove did not look at her. "I'm handling this." "You'll kill him." "Step back." She was still wearing her scrubs. Still had her name badge. Still looked like a nurse in a hospital full of hierarchy and protocol and men who did not listen to women who cleaned bedpans. But something in her voice, something that had nothing to do with courtesy or deference, made the room pause. A resident turned. "Wait, the CVP." The patient's oxygen saturation dropped. 68, 62, 58. "Needle," Brooke said, and moved. Later, she would not remember crossing the room. She would remember only the sensation of muscle memory taking over, the kind that lives in tendons and nerve endings, in the unconscious architecture of hands that had worked on bodies in places where there was no margin for error. Kandahar. FOB Shank. The surgical tent with the canvas sides flapping like broken wings. The weight of a trauma surgeon's voice in her ear, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, "That's your entry point, Sullivan, you've got this." She had this. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. The syringe pulling back dark fluid, old blood, pooled and clotting, the heart's own pressure crushing itself. O2 climbing, someone whispered. 75, 82, 88. The heart monitor shifted. The wild fluttering became something closer to order. The rhythm was returning. Sinus rhythm. The patient's oxygen saturation climbed to 94. His eyes flickered. Silence. Not the silence of peace. The silence of a room understanding that something had just happened that could not be explained by a nurse's job description. Hargrove stood frozen, the defibrillator paddle still in his hands, and his face had gone the color of old bone. A resident was staring at Brooke's hands, which were shaking now, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of emergency and the terrible knowledge that she had just revealed herself in the worst possible way. The crash team lead looked at her. "How did you?" "Scope creep," Hargrove said quietly. His voice was flat. "Dangerous. That's what happens when boundaries disappear." But he was already reaching for his phone, his fingers moving with purpose. He stepped out of the room without looking back. Brooke heard the hallway door close. Heard him speaking low, urgently, a conversation that sounded like the future being rewritten. She looked down at her hands, still wet with the patient's blood, and thought about the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one she had carried for 3 years without anyone knowing what it meant. The one she had hidden the way soldiers hide scars. The one that would not stay hidden anymore. The patient's eyes found hers. They were clear now. Present. And though he could not speak, she saw something flicker there, recognition, or the ghost of it, a muscle memory of his own. The alarm came at 2:06 a.m. 3 short bursts, then the continuous wail that belonged only to room for 12. Brooke was moving before the second alarm sounded. The night shift crew had been sparse, 3 nurses, 1 resident, a skeleton crew of respiratory and cardiac staff rotating through the floors. She had been charting in the station when the monitor showed the change, the steady blip of sinus rhythm turning ragged, then frantic, then collapsing into the electrical chaos of a heart drowning in its own fluid. Cardiac tamponade. She knew it the way she knew the difference between incoming mortar fire and artillery rounds, not from reading, but from the weight of it, the particular physics of pressure and consequence. She was at the bedside in 12 seconds. The mute veteran was conscious, his eyes wide, his mouth open in that silent scream that had defined his existence for 3 years. His oxygen saturation was already falling, 94, 92, 88. The monitor screamed a rhythm that was no rhythm at all, the electrical impulse of a heart being crushed by fluid pressing from outside. Ventricular pulses, she thought, using the terminology before she caught herself, before she remembered she was supposed to be just a nurse from the floor. Dr. Chen was there, young, competent on routine cases, standing frozen at the foot of the bed. "Get a line," he said, which was wrong. Wrong first move for tamponade. Wrong priority. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. The 4-pump beeped softly, indifferent. Brooke's voice dropped. Not a request. Not deferential. Ultrasound. Now. 2 liters normal saline wide open. Type and cross for 2 units. She did not look at him when she said it. She was already at the bedside, her hands moving through the ritual that belonged to a different life, a different woman. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, harsh and white, and underneath the hum was the memory of helicopter rotors, the chaos of a fire base south of Kandahar, the weight of Corporal Davidson's body across her shoulders as she ran through dust and gunfire toward the medevac bird. Pain was information. That was what she had learned. Pain told you where the wound was. Pressure told you how much time you had left. The veteran's oxygen was 84 now. Dropping. His blood pressure had gone soft, she felt it in the faint flutter at his radial artery, thread-thin and desperate. The ultrasound unit arrived. She positioned the probe herself, angled it subcostally, found the pericardial sac immediately. Dark fluid. Thick fluid. Blood. He was bleeding into the space around his own heart, and every beat was pumping him toward arrest. "Move," she said to Dr. Chen. Not a suggestion. The emergency cart came. A nurse she recognized, Marcus, night shift, for years on the unit, started the second line without being asked. He was watching her. Everyone was watching her now. Brooke swabbed the skin with betadine, the smell of iodine cutting through the antiseptic fog of the unit. The location was straightforward, 5th intercostal space, mid-axillary line. She had done this under conditions that would have made this fluorescent-lit room feel like a luxury spa. She had done this with mortar fire coming in, with her patient bleeding out, with her spotter already dead and the extraction team pinned down on the ridge above. The needle was 18 gauge, long, with a draining catheter attached. She felt the penetration through the skin, the subtle give of the intercostal muscle, and then the hiss of air escaping. Dark blood backed up into the syringe immediately. 40 milliliters came out in the first draw. Pressure equalizing. The fluid that had been crushing his heart now flowing into a collection bag. The monitor changed. Oxygen sac climbing, Marcus said, his voice steady. 88, 90. 92, 94. The veteran's chest was rising now, actually rising, not that shallow gasping that meant suffocation from inside. BP stabilizing, Chen said, and there was something in his voice, not shock exactly, but recognition. Recognition of something that didn't fit. Brooke held the catheter steady and looked at the monitor, normal sinus rhythm. Clean. Perfect. A heart that could beat again. She took one measured breath, the kind she had learned to take when the world was falling apart around her, and she withdrew her hands from the field. The room was very quiet. "I need some jello," she said, keeping her voice level, the way she always did. "And someone needs to call cardiothoracic. He's going to need a pericardial window." No one moved. Marcus was staring at her hands. Chen was staring at her face. The resident who had come running, whose name she could never quite remember, was staring at her chest, where the arm of her scrub top had ridden up slightly when she reached for the cardiac monitor. There were scars there. Old scars. The kind that came from shrapnel and IEDs and the particular violence of combat medicine performed under fire. She was not supposed to have those scars. She was supposed to be unremarkable. She was supposed to be invisible. The veteran's hand moved. His right hand, the one with her name tattooed across the forearm in block letters. Brooke. 2 syllables. Her entire identity rendered in ink across the arm of a man who had not spoken in 3 years. His fingers found hers. Not a grip. Not a grip because he could not speak and could barely move, but a touch. A tether. A message between 2 people who had survived something that no one in this room could comprehend. She did not pull away. She let her hand rest there for exactly 3 seconds, and then she stepped back from the bed. Professional distance. Clinical composure. The mask that had held for 3 years, cracking now in the fluorescent light where everyone could see. Brooke, Chen said slowly, testing the word. Testing the name the patient was holding in his hand. How did you know to do that? Scope of practice, she said, and her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Not a nurse making a suggestion. A person giving orders. Someone needs to call the attending. Someone needs to get Hargrove on the phone and tell him his patient is stable. She did not wait for a response. She turned and walked toward the medication dispensary, her hand shaking, but not from fear, Marcus would remember later, not from uncertainty. From restraint. From the terrifying calm that comes from having already survived the worst. From the particular trembling of someone who has learned to hold everything together and is now feeling the seams beginning to tear. Behind her, the monitor continued its perfect rhythm. Sinus, sinus, sinus. A heartbeat. A life. Another person who would survive because she had remembered who she used to be, just for a moment, just long enough to do what needed doing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 2:38 a.m., when she was updating the chart and she heard the phone call going through to Dr. Hargrove's house. The worst part came when she saw him arrive 40 minutes later, still in pajamas, already making calls to the numbers he kept in his phone, the board members, the references, the people who owed him favors or whom he had leverage over. The worst part came when she realized, watching his face as he examined the patient she had saved, that she had just revealed something no amount of deference could bury again. She had forgotten to stay invisible. And now everyone had seen exactly who she was. The room had gone silent at 2:06 a.m. Sinus rhythm. The monitor confirmed it. Brooke had moved without thinking, her hand executing a procedure that belonged in a trauma bay, not a hospital floor, and every nurse present had watched her shoulders drop with the precision of someone who'd done this before, not once, but dozens of times. Under fire. Under mortar. Under circumstances none of them could imagine. Dr. Hargrove stood in the doorway for exactly 7 seconds, watching her wipe her hands on a towel as if she'd just changed a dressing. Then he left without speaking. By 3:14 a.m., he was making calls. The first call went to Marcus Chen, a board member with controlling interest in 3 San Diego medical centers and a weakness for vintage scotch that Hargrove had exploited over 4 years of strategic lunches. "We have a problem at Sacred Heart," Hargrove said, his voice smooth as oil. "A protocol violation. Scope of practice breach. I'm documenting everything, but I wanted you aware before it escalates." Chen listened. Chen had power, and Hargrove had cultivated him like a garden, attending his daughter's medical school graduation, remembering his wife's kidney transplant anniversary, knowing exactly when to mention that his influence could make certain licensing issues disappear. One call to Chen was a thread. Pull it, and the whole we've unraveled. The second call came at 4:38 a.m., to an HR investigator named Patricia Walls who'd worked for 3 separate hospital systems and knew how to dig. Hargrove had her number, he'd used her twice before. "I need a background audit," he said. "Employment history shows some irregularities. Gaps. Unexplained transitions between facilities. I want to know where she worked before San Diego, and more importantly, why those records are so clean they look sanitized." Brooke had been careful. Very careful. She'd changed her name, worked under a private contracting service that had dissolved in 2019, used references from agencies that no longer existed, provided addresses that were temporary shelters or hotels long since demolished. To anyone digging, her employment history would look like it had been scrubbed, not hidden, but deliberately erased. Which raised exactly the questions Hargrove wanted raised. The third call went to two of those references, retired agency coordinators who didn't know Brooke Sullivan the nurse, only knew the paperwork. Hargrove didn't ask direct questions. He never did. He asked about verification procedures, about background check protocols, about why certain employment gaps lasted 3 to 18 months. He asked if it was standard practice to provide such minimal documentation. He asked if they'd ever seen references vanish from official records. By 6:38 a.m., when the day shift arrived, Hargrove had already planted for separate investigation threads and activated political pressure at the board level. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't storm around the unit. He simply made certain that when Brooke Sullivan clocked out at 7 a.m., the machinery had already begun its slow, institutional destruction. It took 48 hours. The termination letter came at 2:22 p.m. on a Friday, delivered to her in Hargrove's office with HR present and a legal pad that documented every alleged violation. Scope of practice violation. Unauthorized medical procedure. Patient endangerment through overreach. Insubordination in accepting a role outside her certification. The words blurred together because Brooke had stopped listening after the first sentence. It wasn't a request, Hargrove said, sliding the letter across his desk. It was a command. You're done here. She didn't flinch. One measured breath. She picked up the letter, read it fully, then set it back down. When do you need my badge? That was all. No argument. No plea. No tears. She stood, removed the hospital ID from her scrubs, and placed it on his desk. The same desk where he'd watched her save a man's life and decided that competence was a threat to his authority. Her locker took 3 minutes to clear. The cracked mug from a hospital fundraiser in 2021. A dying succulent that hadn't seen sunlight in 4 months because she'd hidden it in the back corner, unable to throw it away. A photograph, faded now, edges worn soft from 17 years of carrying it in her wallet, of a young man with a sniper rifle and her smile. His name had been Michael. He'd been her spotter in Kandahar. He'd been 23 years old when an IED took his legs at the knees and his life somewhere between the blast and the medevac. She'd never told anyone at Sacred Heart that she'd held him while calling for the helicopter. Never told anyone that she'd spent 3 years learning to disappear so she wouldn't have to see his face in every patient who screamed. Brooke packed everything into the cardboard box one of the orderlies had given her, then she walked toward the exit with her shoulders level and her eyes fixed on the automatic doors. Nobody watched her leave. There was no gathering at the exit, no quiet prayers, no card signed in secret. Hargrove had made certain of that. Isolation. Social erasure. The slow, methodical removal of any connection to the place she'd tried to heal. The rain hit San Diego at 2:51 p.m. like it had a personal grudge. Sheets of it, cold and persistent, soaking through her jacket in seconds. Brooke sat on a bus stop bench 3 blocks from Sacred Heart, the cardboard box balanced on her knees, and stared at the wet pavement. The unit patch was still inside her jacket lining, sewn there by her own hands in 2021, right after she'd arrived at San Diego and decided to start over. It had been there through every shift, every humiliation, every moment she'd forced herself to forget who she was. Now it pressed against her ribs like a secret she'd carry to her grave. The cash in her wallet came to $247. Not enough for a motel. Not enough for a month's deposit. The hospital had paid through today, so she had just enough for groceries if she stretched it. Her sister in Phoenix had offered 1,000 times to send money, to let her stay, to help her rebuild. Brooke had never asked. Asking meant explaining. Explaining meant telling her family that the decorated senior chief they'd once known had come home broken, that the sound of a helicopter still made her hands shake, that a man with her name tattooed on his arm was the only person who understood that some silences were chosen and some were survived. She reached down and touched the patch through the fabric of her jacket. For 17 years, she'd worn it invisibly. For 17 years, she'd been someone else. A nurse. Just a nurse. Someone quiet and competent and utterly, completely forgettable. Maybe they were right. Maybe she didn't belong here. Maybe Hargrove had simply seen what she'd been trying to hide all along, that she was too much, too dangerous, too trained for a world that only needed people with certifications and compassion, not people with muscle memory for procedures that belonged in combat zones. The rain pounded harder. Her hands were shaking now, but not from cold. She looked at the photograph of Michael, at his young face and his smile, and she thought about throwing the whole box into the gutter. The mug. The plant. The picture. The patch. All of it, gone. She could start fresh. No name. No history. No ghosts. She held the box over the gutter. Her fingers loosened. And then her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Is your mother Brooke Sullivan? She stared at it for 3 seconds. Then another message, my name is Captain James Reeves. I need you to listen very carefully. Thunder rolled across the city like artillery fire, and somewhere in the distance, almost too far to hear, there was a sound she'd forgotten, the distinctive thump-thump-thump of rotor blades cutting through rain. Getting closer. Her 17-year-old son found her at the apartment with the termination letter still on the table, the words defective immediately staring up like an accusation. He dropped his backpack with a thud that made her look up from the envelope she'd read 47 times. Marcus stood in the doorway, breathing hard, rain dripping from his hoodie onto the worn carpet. His eyes held something she hadn't seen in years, the same intensity she remembered from his father's service photographs. Mom, they need to see these, he said, and he held up a shadow box. The one she'd buried in the garage 3 years ago beneath old paint cans and Christmas decorations she couldn't face unpacking. Inside it, medals arranged on midnight blue felt. Bronze Star with Valor. Navy Cross. Purple Heart. 2 of them. A folded flag from a ceremony she'd never let him attend. Brooke's hand moved to her chest. Not trembling. Never trembling. Just a measured breath, the kind she'd perfected in a Kandahar field hospital while rounds of small arms fire punched through the tent canvas above her head. Marcus walked toward her, the shadow box catching the lamplight, and for a moment the apartment was silent except for the rain hammering the windows like code. I found the discharge papers too, he said. And the letters from your commander. The ones in the showbox under your bed. He set the box on the table next to the termination letter. 2 narratives of her life, side by side. One said she was a liability. The other said she was a hero. Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. 12 years. 3 tours. You never told me. She looked at her son, this person who'd grown up watching her erase herself, who'd learned to ask no questions about the helicopter sounds that made her go rigid on the porch at night, who'd never wondered why his mother kept every light in the apartment burning. I was trying to be someone else, she said quietly. Someone small enough to be safe. Marcus's voice cracked. You're not small, Mom. You've never been small. And that guy at the hospital, the one you stay late to see, he has your name on his arm. He was looking for you. The next morning, Marcus walked into Sacred Heart's administrative wing dressed in his school clothes, and he didn't ask for permission. The receptionist tried to stop him. The administrator's assistant reached for her phone. But Marcus had something his mother had given him, the ability to move through fear like it wasn't there. He walked straight into the CNO's office, past 3 people telling him to wait, and he spoke with the clarity of someone who'd been waiting 17 years to say these words. My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, he said. She saved a veteran's life 2 days ago. And you fired her because your doctor was threatened. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights buzz overhead. The CNO, a woman named Patricia Chen who'd run this hospital for 8 years with a kind of steady competence that Brooke would have recognized instantly, looked at the teenager standing in her office. Then she looked at the personnel file already open on her desk. The file marked Sullivan, B. The one Hargrove had flagged for irregular employment history and scope of practice violations. She opened the service record that Marcus had brought with him. 2 pages in, her face went white. Bronze star with Valor, she whispered, reading the citation. You're saying this Brooke is the same? Same who pulled 847 lives out of active war zones, Marcus said. Same who trained army medics. Same who has more medical credentials than half your ER staff. The phone call went out before noon. Not a hospital security. To the Pentagon. By 3 p.m., a man in Navy dress blues walked through Sacred Heart's main entrance with a Chief of Naval Operations aide and a folder that made the hospital's entire administrative structure recalibrate their understanding of what had happened in the past 48 hours. The SEAL Team 3 leader, call sign Breaker, service record that made admirals listen, entered the CNO's office where Hargrove was already seated, already preparing his explanation, already calculating which board members would stand by him. Breaker didn't sit down. He didn't make it a conversation. He opened the file and he began speaking in a voice that carried the weight of 847 lives and 3 Bronze Stars and a Navy Cross that Hargrove had never heard of until that moment. Senior Chief Sullivan performed emergency combat medicine under fire on 347 separate occasions, Breaker said. His voice was measured. Clinical. Devastating. In 2019, she conducted a field pericardiocentesis in a forward operating base in Helmand Province with a 12-gauge needle and a centrifuge she'd improvised from a field medical kit. The patient survived. All 18 patients on that ward survived. He turned the page. 2 Purple Hearts. 1 for shrapnel wounds sustained while evacuating a 7-ton vehicle from an ambush zone. The 2nd for 3rd-degree burns incurred while establishing a medic station under ongoing fire. Hargrove's hands were shaking now. His board connections, the ones he'd spent 6 years cultivating at fundraisers and country club lunches, were suddenly on conference calls with people 3 levels above them, people whose authority made their authority look like a children's game of kings. You relieved her of duty, Breaker continued, for performing an emergency pericardiocentesis. The exact procedure she taught to 6 different combat medical units. The exact procedure that saved the life of Petty Officer First Class Rivera in room for 12, a man she pulled out of a collapsed compound in Kandahar while your medical school was teaching you to prioritize institutional hierarchy over patient survival. The silence lasted 8 seconds. Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. No words came. His face had drained to the color of old bone. Dr. Hargrove, the CNO said quietly, I think you should prepare to leave the building. 36 minutes later, the same security guard who had handed Brooke her cardboard box, the one with the cracked mug and the dying succulent and the photograph of her spotter who died in Kandahar, walked into Hargrove's office carrying an identical box. The doctor was standing at his window, his hand on the frame, staring out at San Diego as if he'd never seen it before. I believe you know the way out, sir, the guard said. He set the box on the desk with a quiet thud. His eyes met Hargrove's for exactly 1 second. It was the longest second the doctor had ever experienced. In that second, Hargrove understood that he was not being fired by the hospital. He was being removed by the United States Navy. He was not a local administrator anymore. He was a problem that needed solving. The distinction changed everything. By evening, the local news was running the story, San Diego nurse's secret military past exposed after wrongful termination. By the next morning, the state medical board had suspended his license pending investigation. By the following week, federal investigators had arrived with notebooks and questions about his financial arrangements with outside consulting firms, his property holdings, his relationships with pharmaceutical representatives, all the small corruptions that accumulate when a man decides he's too important for rules. But Brooke didn't watch the news. She didn't follow the investigation. She walked into Sacred Heart at 6:36 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, still in her own scrubs, still wearing the same jacket with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the one she'd carried for 3 years without letting anyone touch it. The staff parted for her like water finding the path of least resistance. Doctors nodded. Real nods. The kind that come from respect, not politeness. Room for 12 was quiet when she entered. The mute veteran lay in his bed, awake, his eyes focused on the doorway as if he'd been waiting. As if something in his broken nervous system had been holding space for her through all the years and the distance and the silence. Brooke approached his bed slowly, the way you approach someone who's been through mortar fire and comes awake expecting violence. His hand moved. His eyes cleared. 2 years of absence fell away and suddenly he saw her, not the nurse in scrubs but the medic in body armor, the one who'd held his arm steady while calling for medevac, who'd whispered her name so he'd have something to focus on besides the pain. "Senior Chief," he said. His voice was raw from disuse, but it held her rank like a prayer. Brooke reached out and took his hand. With her other hand, she pulled the unit patch from inside her jacket, the one with the gold stitching, the one that had kept her connected to who she was even when she was trying so hard to be invisible. She held it where he could see it. Where he could touch it. "I'm here," she said. "I'm here now." The hospital administrator offered her the position of Chief of Trauma Services 3 weeks later. She declined. She asked instead for a single assignment, establish a veterans medical wing with dedicated PTSD screening and a partnership with the VA medical system. They gave it to her. She built it herself, every protocol, every partnership, every decision made on the principle that healing meant seeing people completely, not leaving parts of them in the dark. 6 months later, someone spotted Dr. Hargrove at a strip mall urgent care in Tucson, Arizona, mopping the floor beside the bathrooms. The name tag on his navy polo shirt said Steve. He'd flinched when a patient called him doctor. He was making $15.37 an hour. The state medical board had officially revoked his license pending the federal investigation, which had already expanded to include for other hospitals and a pattern of behavior that required lawyers, depositions, and conversations with the DEA about opioid prescription patterns and kickback arrangements. Brooke didn't need the news to tell her. She could feel the shape of the world realigning itself back toward balance. That was the thing about combat, it taught you to recognize when an enemy position had collapsed, when the momentum had shifted, when you'd moved from survival into victory without noticing the exact moment of transition. She was back in room for 12 on a Monday morning, checking the mute veteran's vitals, when he asked her to sit. His voice was stronger now. Therapy was working. Neuroplasticity was doing the work that medicine couldn't quite reach. He was remembering how to speak, how to inhabit the life that he'd been given a second chance at. "You could have told me," he said. "Back then. In Kandahar. You could have said your name out loud instead of just teaching it to me through your hands." Brooke adjusted the blood pressure cuff without looking at him. "I was teaching you how to survive, Rivera. Names are luxuries for people who've already made it through. You made it through." "Yes." She met his eyes. Held them. "I did." Rivera reached up and touched the patch on her uniform, the one she wore now on her sleeve instead of hidden in a lining. The same patch that had been sewn into darkness for 3 years. "Then maybe it's time to say your name out loud. Let people know who they're talking to." Brooke adjusted her stethoscope and smiled, barely, just enough for him to see it. "They already do," she said. "That's the whole problem now." That evening, sitting on her porch with the city lights spreading out below like a map of second chances, Brooke realized she wasn't waiting for the sound of helicopters anymore. She wasn't bracing for the noise that meant incoming fire. The trembling, the thing she'd thought was fear all these years, had been something else entirely. It was restraint. It was the effort of holding an entire self inside a smaller frame for so long that release felt like violence. She'd spent 3 years becoming invisible to heal. She'd spent the past weeks becoming visible to help. The shift wasn't a paradox. It was the whole point. Healing was just the beginning. Living was something else. Living was walking into a room in a hospital in San Diego and knowing that your name carried weight now, that the patch on your sleeve meant something to every veteran who came through those doors, that the silence you'd chosen was finally over because someone who mattered had broken it for you. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub, saving lives in the dark. The question isn't whether you'll recognize them when you see them. The question is, what will you do when you realize the person you've been underestimating has been carrying the weight of other people's survival in their hands the entire time? Hit that like button if you appreciate the nurses and healthcare workers in your life. Drop a comment if you've ever worked in medicine or know someone who has. Subscribe and let's see what happens next.